see Hagop show, but that's not why we're here. Hagop, that was just an aside while we're showing you for everybody.
Taking the shine.
You're killing me. I'm red. Go on.
So everybody, so happy you're here tonight. We're so excited. And I'll make my intro short of me, and then we're going to get started really quickly. So first of all, actually, Nicole Bell, who, so Nicole and I thought of these wonderful artists, and we're very proud of pairing them up because they're so good together. And she was going to do the introduction today, but her car overheated, so she is still trying to make it home. Cool. So I'm going to, because her introduction was all written up, and I'm reading hers, and it's beautiful. So I can take no credit except for reading the text. Before I want to introduce Surge and Jinx, just want to put out a few thank yous. So first one to Casey Yoshiaka, who has been volunteering her time to put together the most beautiful website. And you can see the link in the chat. You have videos of the artists speaking of each other's work. I thought that was lovely. That came up with this idea of talking not about their own work, but each other's. And you can find out if you want to go back and see more of the work. I want to thank Michelle Wolfson, who is in the gallery, and the hours are 9 till 5, and she really just is like, yes, making that place amazing. I want to thank our wonderful Elizabeth Prager, who really is first of all, she made a beautiful poster. She set up our Zoom talk today. She is recording and then editing for YouTube, so you can see this talk later on, and really doing so much behind the scenes. And finally, I want to thank the Los Angeles City College Foundation, because they help us fund these events. And now, what I want to say first, and this is Nicole's words, but they're just right out of my heart too, that she and I were both so thrilled that this is our first show back in the gallery, bringing in outside artists after everything we've all been through, and that these two artists are making such exciting and joyful, engaging work. It's really life affirming, and it just makes you want to come together and be there in person. After a year and a half of being online as educators and students, it reminds us of the real joys of seeing and experience art in person with other people, masked and distanced, and all the fun, mind-expanding things that can happen when you get the opportunity to show such thrilling work in the same space. We'll keep the introductions short and brief. I'll start with Surge. Surge Witron is an artist living in the LA Orange County area. He got his AA in studio arts from Fullerton College and his BFA from Arizona State University. He makes really wonderfully layered works, paintings with a real sculptural feel to them, riffling on abstract paintings, but bringing and layering lots of personal artifacts that represent matriarchal family members, ready-made materials, and repurposed play objects. Witrön is an educator, curator, artist, and plant enthusiast. He's a second-generation American to immigrant parents and has exhibited his work in numerous exhibitions in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Mexico City. Jinx Prado is another local artist born and based in Los Angeles. They received a BFA from Cal State Dominguez Hills and an MFA with emphasis in social practice from OTIS College of Art and Design. Prado is an interdisciplinary artist making work that looks specifically at the natural and unnatural. Their intertwining of experience and history as a queer, Mexican-Salvadoran, mixed American into pieces that are visually very appealing with a nice, juicy subtext. They have also exhibited all over Southern California and Mexico City and Japan. Please welcome me and welcoming Surge Witron and Jinx Prado to our VAMA Artist Lecture Series.
Yay!
Rachel said it's not you.
What?
Rachel.
Surge, did you? Elizabeth, maybe I'll hand it over to you as the master of ceremonies. What do you think?
Definitely. So Surge, you were going to go first, right?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Alex and Nicole, and also Elizabeth for coordinating and being the MC for this. And also I see some familiar faces and some new faces on Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Surge Witron, and like Alex mentioned, and kind of give kind of like a background of things I've done in the past and current. Um, what I wanted to kind of do is basically kind of like start where the beginning of kind of my introduction to art, but also where it currently is as well. Um, I think for me, being an artist was something that I had started out as a kid. I knew, I think at third grade, that I was going to be an artist or a dolphin trainer somehow. Either one kind of like blended or not blended. But I, as a kid and stuff, like, I was always creative. I was always artistic. And it was really basically the supporting and an acknowledgement from my third grade art teacher, Miss Wong, who, saw the talent that I didn't see myself possessing. And from there, being catapulted and being placed in gifted art classes. And from there, going on and continuing on my practice and then professional practice has been a journey, but also something that I think it's something that I wouldn't do twice. Like it's something that it's embedded in my DNA of creating and expressing and telling my story. But a little back of some artwork and stuff. I'm going to just share my screen really quick. Let's see here. Let's see. Hopefully you guys can see this. So I'm basically going to go just through my webpage and kind of show the works that I've done in the past and really talk about my style of making. I am an abstract artist, and really my work consists of the artificial and the physical spaces, and really the discovery of the painting itself through mark making and overlaying, underlaying, and really discovering the essence, what it means to make work and decipher those moments and push back and push forward. And that's also kind of like adaptation of how we kind of live in our life, where we're constantly being tucked here and pushed here and trying to network or kind of navigate where we're going through. But some of the earlier work that I started early on was very geometric, very specific to I would say like the very heavy kind of geometric abstract painting. I was absolutely fascinated growing up with architecture, growing up in the city, seeing things kind of blend in, but also somehow lines and textured and shadowing always captured my eye. I remember as a kid going down to Santee Alley in downtown LA, which was a complete as a kid going down there with my
The
family.
link they emailed was wrong. I had to like look at the flyer and be like, oh, this is the right one.
Dakota, can you pause? Can you mute?
Hey, Dakota. Yeah, so I was really fascinated with these kind of these architectural moments when just going shopping or just getting something either in the city or throughout. But my work kind of like tied with that, these very hard edge and these very kind of taking away the humanistic application of mark making. But eventually, going forward, like I started to work with more abstraction, work with more these color fields and that kind of perception of illusion. And for me, it was creating these moments of isolation, but also discovery. There's countless mark making through these paintings, but there's also discoveries. If you were able to like cut this painting in pores, for example, they could be individual paintings themselves. But this was kind of like the beginning of going forward where I'm currently at. But for this body of work that I created for Broke with Expensive Taste, it was really a discovery, I think, for me. I've always, used specific materials to make work, mostly using like Yupo paper and masonite board and canvas as well. But it was really with this kind of this show, I really kind of questioned my materials and started reusing things. But let's go back really quick to some earlier work. So with these current works, like, this was part of a project that I did called Beyond Borders, a show that Carlos Beltran curated, I forgot the year, a couple of years back and stuff, with Nano Rubio. And the show itself was part of a bridge between Pacific Standard Time with LALA. But, kind of like these geometric mark makings consistently go through my work. I use them as like markers, but also to navigate the composition of the work. It's not so much in the front, but it's mostly like embedded in through the mark makings of the backing. But also, let's see here, you might see more of the geometric here, where I remember making these works and stuff, and I remember it was completely chaotic, and somehow, a good professor would kind of tell me, in order to make things, in order to stabilize work, you need to mask the thing that you don't want to kind of, in some way, like create depth to your work, and kind of mask the things that you want, the viewer or yourself to push forward. And creating these type of like very geometric pieces, I started like making these bands through the paintings. You can also see them here. But yeah, this was kind of earlier work on, and this was kind of like the starting point for things that I'm currently doing now. The mark makings that I do now, they're very organic. They're very just continuous and over layering and over adapting. Another project that I kind of created throughout part of the collective that I'm in is called Museum Adjacent. It's a collective of LA-based artists, and we're either showing throughout LA or through international avenues. And one of the things we did prior to that was I did my residency at Toronto Art Museum called Forum 2 with friends. And we did a bunch of projects throughout LA, and it was these moments of creating these projects, and then eventually making a show at the end of our like 12-month residency. But part of the show that Kim Morrow, who was one of the former members, she co-curated, I think actually she curated this project. And like I mentioned, these are kind of the more current work that I kind of created through that, which you still see some moments of geometric abstraction, but they're more fluid, they're more organic. The mark makings are more present through the work. But this is a really exciting project that we did through that residency. And part of the material itself, what I kind of remember doing with these was I did use masonite, which is partially was an economical factor. Masonite, a sheet of masonite at that time, now wood is super expensive. I remember a sheet of masonite 4x8 used to be like $12, and so now I don't even know the pricing for that. And then at that time, it was like for a sheet of that, it was like $8 or $10, and it was just cost effective in making these works. I could basically divide this into fours or make a really big painting, and it would cost me about like $27 or $32 to make. But really, I started bracing the actual material itself to discover the physical material of the painting, and kind of having that as a moment within the abstraction or the mark making in the painting. And that's kind of like these moments here, these pockets of the physical material. In the past, I used to cover the whole material itself. But at this time, I was really discovering what is it that makes me want to paint on this surface, or what is exactly, forcing me to kind of go down to the deep root and really put it to the surface. But that was kind of like the starting point of discovery of the material itself. Going forward, I did participate in this other project called Kipo, which was an art fair in Mexico City. I've known Jinx for through the art scene itself. This art scene is super small. Once you're like in it, you start seeing people here and there. either from school or from just projects that you're seeing people. Kibo was it was part of the museum adjacent as well, the collective I'm in, and it was an amazing experience of just these faceted collectives throughout Mexico and throughout. I think there was a couple collectives from Berlin and Russia, and I forgot how many participants there was in this art fair, but we were part of it. And this is one of the pieces that I had there. But going back to Jinx and stuff, that's where I started talking to Jinx a little bit more because we were both participating in this. But this was a piece that I called Agua Frescas, which in Spanish, refreshing water. This goes back to kind of like my background growing up and stuff. I did grow up as a, I'd say I would say like second generation, but also first, because my parents immigrated to this country as like adults, teens, and in their early 19s and being 19 and 20s. And I had aunties and uncles who I would look up to, and in reference to music, I grew up with learning Janet Jackson and Paula Abdul, and also learning about Selena and Gloria Trevis. And it was this kind of bridging of both, because my uncle and my aunties, who some of us are really close in age and stuff, we all grew up in this kind of network of learning both, or this hybrid of first and second and how things work. But with this painting, I titled it Agua Frescas because it was kind of like I wanted to go to Mexico City and kind of like be very specific in the work that I was showing, being very um, expressive, but also being very open of who I am as an artist. And part of that was this work, and it really was really factored in. I used this like tablecloth that my grandma gave me that I ended up like redying and restaining, and it was one of those things that I felt like I wanted to bring part of me in this space, because I've never shown in Mexico City, but always was fascinated by the actual the city itself and the culture, and just the ambience these fascinated pockets. But really, this was partially the work itself. But yeah, no, has been like continuous. Let me stop here. It's been a continuous kind of like understanding of my practice. Uh, I kind of met Alex through I would say like my studio unfortunately burned down in June, and I lost basically all my practice of 6-7 years and stuff. I lost everything from my physical work through research, through everything, and partially of that was what really forced me to kind of like uh, start questioning and stuff. This used to be my studio here. And, like I mentioned, I lost like 6-7 years of work itself. And this was in Little Tokyo that happened in June. But what this kind of incident that really forced me to do is really start letting go of like, making work for making work. I felt like, every time that I was making work, it was for a consistent show or something else. And I kind of forced myself to make work that I wanted to make, and work that I was, wanted to really put out there, and not just make work for consumption or for kind of for shows. And part of this kind of incident really kind of forces you to do things when you lose everything. I've never been in this situation before, but it really forced me to start rethinking materials, and really understanding what it means to process work and how to make work. This used to be my studio in Lower Tokyo, and it was an amazing studio, but part of it was I ended up losing it. But definitely it was an experience that it really forced me to start revisiting and making work that I wanted to kind of like start presenting to the world. And the work that's in at this current show for Brooke, broke with expressive tape was that physical work, that vinyl, that repurposed industrial material. And yeah, it's part of, I think that's where I'm at right now. If there's any questions about the work.
Or maybe Serge, before we go to questions, could we have Jinx present?
definitely.
And then we'll do questions for both of you as one big happy party.
Also, Serge, just wondering for people that didn't see the show yet, do you have images you can share from the recent show?
Yeah, definitely. The shows from the, let me share really quick. Sure, let me share my screen. So this is some of the work that is in the show itself. So I started reusing vinyl, these printed kind of vinyls that you would find at any fabric store, or I source most of my materials from a local mom and pop shop, and that's probably like 4 blocks away where I live in Orange County in Santa Ana. And I started to really kind of like I used to see these tablecloths or these runners throughout my childhood, like seeing it from my grandma's house or my mom's house. These decorative cloths that would cover dining tables, and they were constantly being changed in and out. For me as a kid and stuff, I never questioned this, like, why is there this like changing decorative kind of like, I just saw it as a dinner table, or a covering that protects it. But a lot of times with homes, we want to decorate our homes and really start putting our own touch there. And I think that's the easiest way to do. You start adding things and really understanding your style. Sometimes it might be cost effective, and sometimes it might just be aesthetic. This is one of the pieces that was in the show, and as you can see the mark makings throughout here. There is like this these pre cutouts that I attached to the piece. Let's see here. This is another piece. This is called Nike. This is it's a 2 feet by 2 feet. It's translucent vinyl, which is basically that clear plastic vinyl that you would see if you go to your grandparents' house and their couches are completely covered in protective kind of vinyl. That would be the material that I'm using for these pieces. But this is a transparent vinyl. I'm using acrylics and spray paints, and also acrylic paint to make these. But really, what really captured my idea for this, or what really was fascinating about the material, was creating the stepness and this illusion of looking into the interior spaces of the painting. That's another view to it. This is another piece in the show itself. For this one, it was kind of like the same kind of mark makings. And also, if you actually go to the show itself, there is QR codes throughout the gallery where you can scan it, and once you start scanning it, it gives you more in-depth description of the piece itself. So this is a very tongue-in-cheek piece that I made. This is called Apple Bottom Jeans with the boots and the fur. Kind of like going back to nostalgia of this. Like I remember dancing this as a teenager and stuff. And one, this song by Flow Rider, I think it was. I title a lot of my works based on lyrics about. It necessarily does not have a connection with the work itself, but it's usually like a tongue-in-cheek kind of like marker in my work that I just add to just play with it. It's humorous. It's familiar with the viewer. Most of these titles come from music that I listen to or current songs, but really they're not influenced by the work itself or making the work. They're just these humorous kind of markers to kind of add familiarity to the viewer. But this is also vinyl or pre-made vinyl with vinyl inserts. And I think that's another one. So this is another piece that's completely, you can see the actual vinyl itself. Partially of it, the great thing about vinyl, it's very industrial. It adapts and does what it wants to do, and it's not gonna bend. You could do so much and kind of sew it, steam it, and get all those creases out. But in reality, it's gonna unfold, and you kind of need to be willing to adapt, but also accept it. And I think that's partially, as artists, we need to accept our materials and accept what they're able to do. We could try to manipulate them as much as we can, but in reality, it's going to do what it's meant to do. But this is using that industrial thick vinyl with these mark makings and added tapestry in there. I also kind of like hung these two specific pieces that we have, which I'm going to show next slide, as kind of tapestry works. And during the pandemic, I think, earlier on when we were all kind of like not trapped, but kind of like forced to be at home and really start being being protective and staying home and making sure that we're not spreading something or catching something early on in the pandemic. And I remember on my feeds on Instagram, I was constantly kind of embedded with the feed of tapestry. And I think during that time, people were constantly DIYing their spaces. They were painting, throwing walls, or restaining their cabinets. And it was a time of change for a lot of people because of this extra time that they possibly didn't have, or projects that they pushed it on the side. Maybe we'll do it when we get some downtime. And I started seeing these kind of on my Instagram feed, all these tapestries and like kind of macrames, and really it made me kind of question, like, okay, somehow this like algorithm on Instagram is telling me that I'm constantly seeing these videos, but in reality, it's like I'm also changing my space, and I'm adhering to my environment and my surrounding, and I kind of want to create work that was traditional to tapestries, but also do it in my own take, and started making these pockets in the painting itself. If you see these are specific pockets that are interchangeable, like any decorative piece or tapestry. They're interchangeable through the person's aesthetic or their preference, and they're interchangeable. You can change paintings throughout there. This is another piece that I did, which was the pre-made vinyl as well. You can kind of see a more kind of it still hangs in the tradition of an actual tapestry, but also it's hung by L brackets, which are a little bit industrial. It's stained on a beam. But the beauty about this, I started playing with the scallop motif that was already embedded in the work, and really kind of pushing these specific markings that I do in my paintings, and these overlappings. And this was kind of the work itself. This is one of Jinx's pieces here. But yeah, this is, I think that's it for these pieces. I don't think if I have another one on this side.
Thank you, Surge. That was awesome. And I don't know if you saw, but there was a lot of love in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, also as the intermission pause before Jinx takes over, if you have questions for the Q&A and they're coming to you now, you could add them to the chat at any point. And then after Jinx presents, we'll be doing a Q&A with the both of them. All right, Jinx, we're so excited.
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me? All right, so for this presentation, I actually want to show a performance video that correlates to one of the pieces But just real quick, my name is Jinx Prado. I'm a Los Angeles artist. I do performance, sculpture, interdisciplinary. And, it's really nice to just be here and just to see a lot of familiar faces, see some new faces, and to just be able to share some of the things that, what's on my mind. And hopefully to be able to hear what's in everybody's mind. So what I'm gonna do is that I'm going to send a link to the chat, and it's pretty much a 5-minute video from YouTube that is one of the performances. It's called 6,000 Heavy Lifting. And we're just gonna take the time to pretty much see the videos within our own screens because it'd be a lot easier and for the less risk of it being glitchy. And pretty much like in another 5 to 6 minutes, we'll just come right back here and then I'll just further discuss about what that video was about and just as well as some of the things in my own website. All right. So I'll see everybody in about 5 minutes and we'll be able to go further in. All right, so, oh, let's see here.
One sec, everyone. We're gonna work out some sound.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so um, this correlation of this video is pretty much in part of one of the sculptures I created for the show. And that when I'm just gonna share the screen right now. When I first pretty much started the performance, I did not have really much a sculpture to think of. It was pretty much that the sculpture would be the thing that would be communicating with some of my past works. So I don't know if everybody could see the screen right here. Is that what we have from the show is a few of my burlap embodiments, which is what I call a lot of my burlap sculptures. And from what you guys saw from the performance video is pretty much inspired by this one in particular, the mixed burlap collection. Now, from what this piece was pretty much a mix of is the 6,000 heavy lifting, as well as two other performances, which is the great mixed burlap and also the heavy decay, which is different performances that have been endurance works. And the suit that the burlap figure is wearing is a suit that I've worn as well, that I put up so I could be able to demonstrate like this character that I created called Mixed Burlap. It's kind of like a little mix of the natural and artificial, but of human nature. Because I would see that burlap would be like the mix of both the natural aspect of what it's made out of, which is like plant, and then the artificial of it being put together, woven in this burlap form. And from what you would tell from those who've seen the show and from those who are going to be seeing the works that I'm showing today, is a lot of the work that I have is inspired a lot with like burlap works. Now, the reason why I work with burlap was that I've pretty much started with a mix of the different materials that were used for construction. And that when I've started with the construction pieces, I just decided to go narrow it down just to burlap. Mostly because of what happened during the COVID pandemic, where my studio was just inaccessible and that material had to be minimized. So it's kind of like in the same situation with Surge that we both kind of communicated about when it came to looking at adaptation and just the materiality of our works. And that when I initially started with my sculptures, it was a mix of different heavy materials from construction. So like what you'd see here is like different concretes, burlap, wood, different materials that would mix in with nature and artificial. So the grass that you see here in this sculpture is real. It's real grown grass on a wooden box that is pretty much painted with concrete and spray painted with the same type of spray paint that you'd see on construction sites or like in the type of iconography that they place in the streets. And that was something that I started out with, was just looking at iconography and seeing how I could start communicating with my work. And it was very abstract with the bit of realism, with mixing in with nature and mixing in with like, what can you do with these materials that you'd find left down the street or you just have like in your disposal from performances. And I just pretty much mixed in the two to try to communicate the natural and artificial. However, when the pandemic began, we were told that we pretty much couldn't have access to the studios. So they gave us a time limit of just having like a minimum of a day to figuring out what we need to get out of the studios for OTIS college. This was like when I was in grad school still. So when I was just going through my studio and seeing what was my strength, I looked at Burlap. And that it was the one thing that I started working with ever since when that happened. So this is like early 2020, and now like I'm just starting to full on work with Burlap. Some of the things that you'd see here in the screen is somewhat familiar from the show for those who've seen it, and for those who haven't. A lot of it is just, again, correlated with performances that I've done. And there are also different pieces that look and navigate around my body, as well as different things that I'd see in my environment. So it would be like from animals, objects, different human beings that pretty much go around me or just in certain situations. A lot of these pieces are also named in different contexts of verbs. So like this one with the decaying figure is called summer decaying. And then with the one that is just laying down on the ground is just crawling. But it's a series of different crawling pieces that I have, and just of these different ways of like how the human form can mean different things depending on context. So with crawling, it's just like the saying that you crawl, like if you can't walk, then crawl, and then you can't crawl, then pretty much do as you much can so you can be able to get through from any situation. And all these different figures are stuffed with dead plants. Some of them that I've grown, some of them that were found in abandoned areas that were from around Los Angeles, or if just things that pretty much have just been part of life, but I just completely stuffed into these figures to reconfigure it as like a coffin in a way, and just have them as this new form, which is why I call them the Burlap embodiments. They embody the life of what it would have been or what has supported. From this one, looking up, it's just a figure of a head that is stabbed through from like this wooden bar that I've pretty much found from the street. But it was like part of a street sign that you'd see from like the highway, you know, with the giant arrows that you'd have that would navigate you through the freeway. That's one of them. But a lot of like what I make is based on both mythology from European, from Mexican culture, from every different types of cultures, just mixing in and seeing like how I could merge these different things and bringing my own story into it. So I just merge in these different iconographies, different ideas and tales. Like from this one was actually a bit more inspired by like the tale of Goliath, with like this head that's torn off after David throws a stone and kills the giant, as well as just a different mix of like different things from like looking up, being motivated. And with these two hands that is also in the show, I called it rock, paper, scissors. Now for that, it's like going into like back into my childhood, or in just in anybody's childhood, in fact, of just rock, paper, scissors. How we see that as both a fun game, but it could also be a very deviant thing when you think about it. Because rock, paper, scissors is basically idea of conflict. You know, rock beats scissors, paper beats rock, and then scissors beats paper. It's just of like the pros and cons of what each element has, and that these two different hands are just of the signal of just human nature of how they're against each other. So there's like a little playful backstory in a lot of these things that you could visually see straightforward. They're very much more vibrant and enlightening, and they definitely have a humor in them. But I look at it in a different lens of just how we can bring in these different conversations about human nature, of war, of class, of environmentalism, and just conflict, of just things that we look at within society in a way that makes it approachable. And if not, of just has a different meaning, and depending on how an individual can read it. From what I've pretty much looked around from my sculptures, you know, I look at different iconographies of the pose, the colors, and just what is present, especially in the name. you know, like with this one, it's called The Fallen Angel. And, you know, with the story of like the fallen angel, just that has just been given up by God. And then it's just pretty much Satan. But I pretty much put a twist into it and making it more of like this movement symbol of like what you can determine of like what is good, what is evil, and using my own body. So like the torso is my own body, and just the different ways of like how I'm presenting it. And from this heart, it's just heartful. So there's a little face on it. And that is pretty much of just the way of like how I try to create like characters into it to like bring in like a narrative in a way, and just talking about these different ideas of just human nature. Because especially whenever we make something characterized or humane, we end up trying to connect with it better. You know, when it has a face, we try to connect to it in a human level. Without the face, it would just be a heart, and then you'd think more of just like, oh, it's the anatomy and studying of the human body. But once when I put the face in it, I want to try to bring in a discussion of just what exactly is this significant organ outside of the body. And just seeing from the other performances as like an example of just some of these sculptures I just showed. This is actually a Kipo art fair from what Surge talked about before. But this was in a performance moment that I've had when I did a similar piece to like the heavy lifting, which fun fact, I actually did this piece right after I did the 5-day piece of the heavy lifting. Like I flew from OTIS College to Mexico City to do this piece. So it was a hustle at the time, especially when it was pre-COVID. It was like a month before COVID happened. And that in this particular piece, it's called 9,930 Seconds of Heavy Travels, Mexico City. So what that is that these are the gas stations and oil wells that are also present in Mexico City. And what I did is that for 9,930 seconds, or just like pretty much from what I would think 2 hours and 45 minutes, if I remember, is that I had these different concrete and material rubble that was present in the space that was pretty much like curtained out with a giant curtain. And I was just on my knees and pressed these rocks onto the ground, even to the point when my knees were bleeding from in my pants. So if you could recognize that pose from the crawl, it's this. Summer Decay. Which, you know, with the name, it's like summer, and then from the piece I did, it was like in spring. You know, the reason why I put summer is because like with summer, heat, melting, and decaying. But what I also thought of was just how that decaying from the space when we were performing over there, that was so relevant. And that, you know, some of these shots of just the pose of what I've done is just showing of just all of the ways of how I'm navigating with my body into the space from endurance, and seeing how I could be able to maintain myself. And just with the suit itself, this was one of the first pieces that I've done with it, which is called Mixed Burlap Ring for it. What that piece was just like a different elements of my past performances, but using the different items as like artifacts, and then just making it like in a museum type of setting, talking about the critiquing of the institution and seeing like how we look at these ritualistic different performances and how do we look at them through a gallery or museum setting, and what happens when you misplace it, or what happens when you try to dictate it. So people would get the bells that were present in front of me in the box, and they would ring it, and they'd pretty much be followed by my figure. You know, sometimes the figure of myself would just navigate around with the person. Sometimes I'd dance with them. Sometimes I'd be timid or intimidating with them.
I'm doing this because it's extra credit, really important. Okay?
I think someone's audio's on. Oh, sorry. Okay, so anyway, when I was pretty much doing this piece, I was just thinking more of just how could I communicate with the audience? And that pretty much was just something that carried on to like my embodiment pieces, because I just looked at how these figures, how they're posed, how they're positioned, the color, the way how they just appear can have the audience interact with them, even when they're timid. And another piece that pretty much was with the same suit was a second piece called Mixed Burlap, the Great Burlap, which is the inspiration of like the one video that was just about Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, which was just looking at a capitalistic form of just what nature has been brought forth through capitalism. And with me wearing this suit that I tailored to look like a business suit, that would then further go into details of just what this type of thing was just looking at and how do we do that with the form. These are just different visuals from the post-performance. And there is a video that anyone can check up from the website whenever you guys have the time, and that you'd be able to check up from the link right here. And pretty much it's just looking at like how the different silliness and the humor that I do in the performance can bring in different discussions of how we can impact environmentalism. And just pretty much that when we were just looking at the different forms of the body is how we can actually present them. So with the way how I did it with the burlap embodiment for my performance, that's pretty much when I put them together into this one suit, as well as just different forms and how we talk about them. So on another note, with the different forms, you know, this is another piece that is a first that I've done that involves a hanging piece. It's called Living Sins, or like Sins Living, I think. And what it pretty much is just the indication of angels, but the traditional form of like what you think of like an orb with light with different eyes. You know, there's different iconography of the eyes and just what each eye means, but moreover, so it's just the form and looking at how we could discuss these different ideas of religion, symbols of like death, and how we can actually look at it at a different way. And from like the animal series that is pretty much a bit more early on, it's just like different forms of cats. This is pretty much called a poly scratch post, which is actually a type of form that was made by my own cat. You know, it's like the same shape, same body size, because of one day that when I was working in my studio, my cat would always call for my attention every time that she's hungry. And when she's hungry, she would scratch on a wood post that is right in my room. So I had some of the wood that I had on the side just when I was working on some of the things, and she scratched it. And I decided that with that, I can actually use it to show the work. So the scratch post is just with the pose of my cat that is both in rest and in action. And that's pretty much something that I started out with to help me on trying to pose these figures and how I could be able to discuss form and the position of these figures and how we can be able to like read them. Okay, so here's the one with the scratch post. So a lot of it from the work that I do is like looking at humor, but that's because of something that I like that when it comes to humor is it's universal. You know, it's something that we can react with and that we can be able to have a response to without having any type of form of intimidation. While I do think that we should have any kind of reaction in work, and that's the amazing thing about art. But, you know, with humor that I feel that is something that we can look at as a way, as a tool to be able to have like this common knowledge of just how we can respond to something. You know, with laughter, it's not always a laugh that is just from a joke. It could be from fear. It could be from any kind of confusion. It's a response. And that's something that I feel that would be important when it comes to looking at art. Especially when we're talking about like how we look at the world and how we react to it. So besides from art, we look at situations, political events, religion, ideas from how an individual thinks of another. It's something that we react to. And that's something that I try to embody into a lot of these works. From what the piece that we have on the side, it's like a screaming piece. So it's sitting and screaming. It's pretty much more of just like a form practice of just like how we look at like what a response of a form means, like the elongation of a head, and just seeing like what ways that we can look at the idea of screaming. And again, it's just pretty much of like how I name the pieces with verbs because of the actions, but it's also kind of correlating to like my performance side of myself. You know, a lot of the characters that I do and a lot of the things that I talk about pretty much started from a lot of the paintings that I've done. So with some of the paintings that I've pretty much started out, it's like the different ways of how I embody a lot of these different ideas and iconographies. And just like how we can look at these different visuals. You can see like from some of the colors that I've pretty much done, it's just similar to the sculptures that I've done. So from a lot of the work that I've pretty much just looked at, a lot of it is just like going into the different ways of how I impact with myself and endurance. A lot of it could be odd too. So it doesn't always have to be like a very driven body and taking idea. So a lot of it would just be in the form of like discussing about gender. Am I machismo enough? Or just looking at the different aspects of self-love and like self-sacrifice, like the flower that we have right here, this performance piece. That I basically kiss flowers for different durations and then just having like this different stories that are in the bottom of these texts about my past relationships and discussions I've had. And then it just goes a bit more dark when I actually have rose thorns from roses and I pretty much start strangling it as I kiss it and it starts bleeding from my hand. And this is another video that you can see from my YouTube that is linked up to the website as well. And from your own time, you can be able to see it. Just a little warning, there is a bit of body mutilation from the hands, and as well as different topics talking about, you know, relationship issues, domestic violence, and as well as just queer issues that people would face from homophobia, biphobia, and so on. So I think that's pretty much from like my end, from like what I finished from discussing from my body of work as well.
Thank you, Jinx, so much. And I just added your website to the chat, and hopefully Surge could add their website. Everyone, we just heard from two incredible artists, and now is the chance to get your questions answered. What an amazing opportunity. We have that brilliant exhibition that is up in the gallery. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. If you have a question, please type it into the chat and either I can read it, or when it comes to your turn, you can unmute and just go ahead and ask directly. Just let me know what you prefer. If you're shy and want me to read, all good. If you want to be bold and engage and say hi to Surge or Jinx, that's great too. So yeah, so please start adding them to the chat. I see questions coming in. Laura, did you want me to read or did you want to unmute?
I can talk, yeah. Let me just bring it up so I can.
Yeah, please. And again, big thank you to Surge and Jinx for joining us. We are so lucky.
Yeah, that was really inspiring. I used to work in fashion, and I noticed a lot of fashion inspiration. Surge, sorry, I'm addressing you. I noticed a lot of fashion inspiration in your names for your work, like Nike and apple bottom jeans, boots with the fur. Have you noticed any inspiring trends coming up?
Yeah, hey Laura. Yeah, fashion has always been something that I've always, you know, have been extremely like adaptive, but also very conscious about like buying things that work with me. And I've always been big on specific designers that I've always enjoyed here and there. I think fashion also plays in, like, if you look at the tapestry that I'm kind of painting on, using the pre kind of like pre-made kind of tapestries or kind of embedments or embellishments have been something that I've been really really what captures me to kind of paint on these surfaces or recreate them. But trends going forward with my work, I think maybe the way that I present the work itself. Right now, it's a little bit more holding to traditional ways of displaying decorative art, maybe infusing that and making it more of like a ready-made, specific item that you can wear, or something that moves a little bit like actual garments.
Thank you. That was, thank you. That was really nice.
Thank you.
And then we have a comment from B, but before we go there, I just want to let everyone know I put both Jinx's website and Surge's website in the chat, so you'll have ways to keep exploring. B, would you like to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yeah, hey, I just wanted to like thank you for like doing this, and like as like a non-binary trans person, I honestly hate like art school, specifically figure drawing, because of like I don't get to see like bodies that are other than like cis bodies, and so like it was just really great seeing like I don't know, like other like, well, I don't know how you identify, but I know you use they them, and like yeah, like thank you. I'm gonna just keep making art. I'm gonna keep going, and it's cool to see you doing art and making awesome things, so thank you.
Thank you so much for the comment.
Thank you, B. Definitely continue on. I started out like drawing before I started painting. So and I'm actually, I personally think I'm a better drawer than actually I'm a painter, but definitely continue experimenting and just make work.
Yeah, and especially I understand of just like the representation of just like the bodies of non-binary, gender fluid individuals. Like for me, like when I was in grad school, I was pretty much in a closet when it came to like my identity for gender, and that there really wasn't much a discussion at all when it came to different non-binary bodies, artists and creatives. And that I feel that for a lot of us, especially for those who are non-binary, it's a liberating thing for us to be able to be out here and be able to represent and to just make the work and just show that we're here and that we're actually speaking out. We're in the story as well. Thank you so much for the comment.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome. Thank you for asking it. We have another question from, I think, Aaron. Surge, you spoke of accepting your materials. How does the vinyl affect your color palette?
Thanks for asking that question, Erin. Color palette, like I usually choose my colors before I start sketching. I usually choose 6 to 12 different colors and different kind of variations of them. But really the material itself, like the vinyl, what I've noticed, especially when I'm painting on it, sometimes that it adheres or doesn't, depends on how slick or if it has a tooth or not, if it's going to adhere to it. But definitely acrylic base does adhere to it. But also one thing that has been very tricky has been spray paint. I use acrylic based spray paints by Montana Gold. And what I've noticed with the actual acrylics aerosol version of it, it does sometimes bleed, meaning like if it touches a different surface or if it or heat, it'll start either sticking onto it or starts to kind of like saturated. So that's kind of like one of the trickier selection when working with materials that are constantly adhering to the elements, adhering to cold and hot. And it's not like you're painting on Yupa paper or masonite, which you have a little control over. But definitely, it's one of those materials that it's adapting as we adapt with our spaces or what we're doing. And in some way, like I could put like some type of coating to prevent that from happening, but also in some way I kind of accept it for what it is, and I'm not forcing it to be more than the material itself.
Nice. We have our next question is from Roam. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing. They were gonna go ahead and unmute and ask.
Hi. Yeah, it's Rome, just like the place. But yeah,
Oh.
thank you.
Sorry.
It's very commonly mispronounced. I had a question actually. It was for really actually either of you, whichever cares to answer it. How do you choose, I guess, what medium you will use to make a piece of art or artworks? Because I know that Jinx, you worked with almost like, I know it's not sculpting, but it's like 3D basically artwork. Whereas I saw a lot of more of the 2D work with you, Surge. So I was wondering, how do you choose what medium to work in? Or do you get that from the inspiration itself? Or do you basically have like a flip a coin or something? Like, how do you choose what medium to use?
For me, like from what I've pretty much gone through is that I try to see from my strengths and weaknesses of how I want to communicate my messages. So I'm pretty much avid when it comes to painting, photography, drawing, that type of thing. But I pretty much look at it more of like a blueprint method to looking at my 3D forms. It makes me help to think in a way. But when it comes to the actual material, like what I use, I pretty much just look at how does it talk about my messaging. Like when I'm talking about environmentalism, when I'm talking about the natural and artificial, what materials best bring that up? Like besides from the context, it's the content of the work. And for me, burlap was just that one calling because it's both that material that is natural that you can look at and has its own history, but it's also of just my own personal takes of it. And, you know, a funny thing is that from a story is that my grandmother was the one who taught me how to sew. And that when I was learning how to sew, I've asked her just like, hey, what's the one material that you don't like? And she said, oh, it's burlap. And I'm just like, why? And it's just like, oh, it's uncomfortable. It's scratchy. It doesn't work well for anything. And it's like, what the hell are you going to do with it? Like, are you going to use it for weddings or something? And that's it. That's something that was just this funny story that I've always had of my grandmother before she passed away back in 2018. And that was something that I looked at when it came to just looking at materials, when it came to like construction, and moreover, like which one worked best in the end. And in the end, it was burlap.
I think for me, like similar to Jinx, when it comes to making body of work, it really depends on the process, but really what I have in my studio or what materials are accessible to me. But also what Jinx mentioned is the messaging. I'm a painter mostly, and I have worked with sculpture in the past, but really it's how that messaging comes across and how I'm going to basically express that through material or through kind of putting that into that stratosphere and stuff. But definitely it's a process, and definitely right now it's like what I'm using now, it's vinyl, partially because I have like we were mentioning during our talking stuff, we were both in these kind of isolated spaces during the pandemic where I lost everything. Jinx was basically forced to, you know, craft something really fast and kind of work with that material. For me, it was partially a costing, you know, when I lost all my materials, I was like, how am I going to do this? And how am I going to restart again? And I was partially working with pre-made vinyl, and eventually that became kind of the material that I started using because accessibility was part of the conversation, trying to make work and trying to, in some way I was trying to build my arsenal and build work, and this was the easier way for me to make multiple works or make like a body of work without building, without construction, or without you know, spending so much money. And yeah, definitely that's also a factor.
Very interesting. I actually brought up, like, now hearing you both say that kind of brought up, I was wondering about inside my own life because I've never been trained to do sculpturing work. So that kind of intimidates me, I guess, to do like something that's like 3D. Because when I think of ever attempting artwork, like inside of our class, we're doing bodies. So I automatically just think to kind of make a 2D piece of artwork. And I always wondered, like, for people, especially who make like 3D artwork or make artwork that you like, well, especially unconventional materials like you were using the vinyl, how do you decide on that? And I guess it makes perfect sense, like that basically, what is it? How can I best express this? Because I play like piano, and there's sometimes when I get inspiration, and sometimes I want to paint a picture with that inspiration, and other times I want to write a song. So I guess that makes sense. I guess it made sense to me when you mentioned it that way, because it's kind of like how I would choose between the piano, using the piano to make an art piece, or a brush. So you basically would choose between materials that can satisfy what it is you're feeling. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Dakota. Has making work about the body made you more comfortable with it? And I guess this kind of could go for both of you.
For me personally, it did in a way, because when I pretty much was just growing up, I was just a person that had issues with my own body weight. And even today, like, I'm not really as fit, especially with after COVID, got the COVID 30 growing up too. Because like, especially being queer, there's a lot of issues when it comes to just body appreciation. There's a lot of queer individuals represented in media as like very thin, slim individuals, not chubby or, different thick figured. And then for me, just like when I use my own body to form these different sculptures, when I'm measuring it, at first it would feel a bit discomfort with me. But over time, I just look at the different ways of how a body can be formed and just the beauty of it. And just for me being comfortable with just myself, and as well as just how I could be able to represent myself, really does reflect into like how far I've gone with my own work, besides from just being with myself, especially from a lot of my endurance work. Like for the endurance, it really is uncomfortable for a lot of these things, because for those concrete blocks that you've seen from the heavy travels, those were like 50 pounds. So I just been lugging that thing, and just how I've made my own body discomfort. How do I navigate my own space around it? Just like how environment pretty much tries to adapt and endure in the space. So yeah, like from the body of work that I've done, literally body of work, is that it really did make me look at myself differently. And, I have some more confidence definitely than what I've had before from exploring my body.
Yeah, did you want to chime in, Surge? Or?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for asking that question, Dakota. I think, the body of work, like, Jinx was mentioning, being part of this community, and we're so consciously aware about our physical self. And then COVID kind of added some stuff to that. For me now, going forward with the body of work that I'm creating, I've always thought big was definitely something that I needed to do constantly. I've always worked in big kind of format. Most of my paintings are like 4 feet by 10 feet. And somehow I always felt I wanted the bigger kind of like pieces or bigger work in order to take up space. And somehow it was all about sizing. It was always about making big work. And what this kind of fire or this losing of materials will really force me to do is start looking at those intimate moments within our work, or intimate moments of making, and really accepting that. And that was kind of the starting point, because when one of the first paintings that I did after the fire was that vinyl piece, and that's 2 feet by 2 feet. It's one of my smaller work. And that was the starting point of really, revisiting and creating work that makes me happy, and things that I want to present to the world. And that's acceptance and realization as well.
Thank you, Dakota, for the question.
Yeah, and thank you both for those answers. I'm so sorry if I say your name wrong. Yugen is next. Will you go ahead and unmute to ask your question?
Hello, thank you for sharing your work with us. My question for Surge is, I think you already answered my question. I was going to ask you what made you want to choose vinyl over other materials, and you were saying that it's one of necessity after the fire. But after having gone through, like, you using vinyl for your work, what strength do you see in using vinyl over other acrylics or oil? And also your vinyl work doesn't feel like collages. It's still different patches of different material, but it's still a painting to me. So I was wondering how you see your work as a painting instead of a collage, even when you're using vinyl and different materials. And then I'll move on to question for Jinx after you can answer my question. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you for asking that question. Yugen, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yugen.
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 Yugen. Thank you. Yeah, partially like, mentioning back, the vinyl was, it came from a necessity of what I was partially actually before the fire, during the pandemic when, we were being told that we're at the building that I had my old studio in Little Tokyo. I was, management told us that we could not be accessing these spaces or creating anything because at that time, COVID was super heavy. We didn't know how it was contracted. And like I mentioned to Jinx and Alex and Nicole and stuff, I felt like, I was going to catch COVID from like just going to the studio, going downtown because it was super dense at that time. And I would go in and just grab anything that was accessible, like within my space, and just grab things and water my plants. I had a bunch of plants in my last studio and just leave. And partially using the vinyl, I had vinyl already prior to that. And it was so easy to carry because it's so light, it's in a roll. And that was part of, me starting this conversation with vinyl because of accessibility, one thing, and also how it's transport. It's easy to roll and it's easy to move around. And that was needed at that time when I was absolutely isolated and just making work at home and trying to navigate through this climate of change. But also when I started re-examining the material itself, I started remembering, my grandma and remembering, my grandparents' home. Everything was completely covered in vinyl. My grandma had vinyl couches, vinyl, placemats and everything that was so plastically and it smelled like plastic. It smelled like, I don't know, that plasticky smell just, it reminded me of comfort, reminded me of just going into these spaces. And at that time, of course, I wasn't able to go see my grandparents because everyone's quarantined. So utilizing these materials that were familiar and memory has made me kind of like start re-examining them, not just also like because of the cost effective, but also these ideas of protecting vinyl, it's industrial material, but also it protects something. It protects the surface, something that we hold dear to our homes or we want to cover and protect. And that's kind of what I felt during that time frame where I was still kind of entrapped in my home, and it was kind of like a shield in some way that I was painting over or trying to look through. But yeah, definitely it's something I'm still working with. I'm still using pre-made vinyls and trying to figure out what's to come. Your last question, was it about?
So do you see your work as a collage? And if you do, or if you don't, then how is it different to you?
Yeah, the vinyl pieces, I created them as paintings or kind of three-dimensional objects that you could read in the round. It was the intent of making work. And I think some people remember at the gallery last week, and this student asked me, she asked me about the painting until I kind of told her it was vinyl. She's like, I can't believe this is vinyl. I thought it was like, canvas or something. And it's not just as artists, where we manipulate materials and we try to put, we present it in different takes. But for me, it's always been a painting. It's always been materials are a way to kind of bring the message forward, but in reality, it's what the actual idea is. But really, the collage pieces are in between. They're kind of like a hybrid of both because I'm using pre-made vinyl, but also I'm making cutouts. So I'm painting on them, I'm cutting them and reattaching them to existing pieces, or I'm actually cutting up a painting and making collages of that same material. So I'm embedding it back into the painting itself. So they're kind of like a hybrid, I would say.
Okay.
But thank you.
Thanks. And then a quick question for Jinx. And you mentioned that you were using paintings as like a sort of like a jumping off point for your performance and 3D work. And I was wondering if it ever went like the other way, where you got inspiration to make 3D work or performance pieces as your jumping off point for like paintings as like the byproduct of your inspiration from your 3D work.
Definitely, it goes into both ways. So it's pretty much like a type of way of my work communicates with each other. It began pretty much with drawing and painting to communicate with the performances and burlap works, mostly because it got me into like this physical way of just what my mind is thinking of, and just for me to have a clear sense of what it's about. And also with writing too. So like with the different ways of like how I'm looking at my own writing, like what I'm thinking of and my thoughts, and how do I combine a lot of these things. So with just like a lot of my titles and my works for performances, you know, a lot of them are like numerical, humorous, or if not, if they reference something. So like with the heavy travels piece, you know, that one was pretty much inspired a lot more from just what I was thinking of environmentalism. Like what's the metaphor that I could bring best when it comes to like how the environment navigates around to be able to sustain itself? How does it adapt? And in a way, it's pretty much like how a person is placed in a situation where there's a lot of obstacles and they try to maneuver and have a goal in mind. That's pretty much how a lot of the performances began. Okay. However, when it came to a lot of the visuals of like what I put into the performance, the artifacts, the iconography, a lot of it pretty much was like from both the drawings, paintings, and like how do I visualize that?
Oh, I see.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we're gonna get a question from Nicole.
Hi. Sorry, I was late. I was supposed to be here at the beginning. I first just want to say how so totally thrilled I am that that all of this is happening, that we have both of you as artists in our space, and that we get to have these great conversations. Actually, it's funny because Surge, you already kind of half answered my question. I was going to ask about, because I was reading your artist statement and thinking about what I wanted to say about both of your work if I had been here in the beginning. And you talked about maternal and like matriarchal references and working within the family. And then Jinx, you just brought up, right, this like this connection you had with your grandmother. And so I was interested in, I mean, I'm a mom, so like I would love to hear about how the matriarchal figures in your life influence, but I guess to even open it up more broadly in terms of familial influences and things. It sounds like kind of in both of your work, these things are kind of in a really interesting way bubbling up, either like consciously or subconsciously. And I was wondering if you both felt, I don't know, wanted to address that or felt like it was part of it or not.
Yeah, for me, like the matriarchy like plays into, you know, people in my my upbringing. Like my mom has always been a big figure in my life, and also has been super supportive. But also my grandma was one who really pushed me, and she was always the one who knew that I was an artist, and she was always like making and in some way making sure that I was making work at a young age, and really nesting and putting details into that. In my previous work and stuff, I've used like family emblems. I use, you know, my grandma's tapestries in my work, where in some way, you know, I'm putting, you know, not graffiti, but I'm like painting over these family kind of items. And in some way, like my grandma, I've asked her like, can I do this? And she would go, she's like, why wouldn't you paint on something else? Why would you ask for permission? Because you're the one that really is, you know, telling that story or telling that message. You don't need to ask me if you're going to be painting this, just do it. And it's always been these figures that have been super strong. I have two siblings who are educators, nurse. They've always been these strong figures in my life, my siblings. And yeah, definitely, I would say just that supportive kind of endeavor of just being present and being supportive and being active in the way that I grew up, but also in my practice. Support is definitely needed.
And for me, there is like a lot of connections to my family, and a lot of it from my grandmother too. Mostly because like from the time of growing up, you know, she was like the inspiration for me to just go into my endeavors, especially when she's like a first generation coming into the US from Jalisco. You know, she migrated here and that she had these opportunities that she's always wanted. Like she always wanted to be a nurse growing up, but unfortunately with, you know, a lot of the things that have gone with like gender norms in the past and just how strict they were, especially in a Mexican family with machismo culture going in, you know, she was forced to pretty much be more of a mother. And that when I was growing up and I didn't know what to do in my life, she pretty much was just supporting me and just like putting me into like these roads of just thinking more just my future. So I even done a piece inspired of her actually called the Ronin Gringo, which is pretty much of just, you know, just both of my own identity for me, like having white skin, and as well as just having these different cultures of like, how do I navigate around like family and the histories of it coming in. And I did have like this idea of just like my grandmother coming into the US, having to run and surviving these different obstacles. Basically, it's like more of an endurance piece too. Pretty much a lot of like the things I've done even today, like labor intensive endurance pieces, the sewing of fabrication of these different works that just from the labor of like how my grandmother grew up being like a fabricator for clothing and just how she ended up maintaining herself throughout her life. Definitely, it really has like a connection to my work.
Thank you both. And our next question is from Miguel.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see y'all, and thank you so much for sharing your work and really knowing that intimate process of your work. I have, as a Latinx person myself, and seeing you as artists out there and taking up some space and talking about queerness and bodies and all this. You're talking to me. I'm your audience. I work in fashion and talking about textiles. You guys are definitely talking. So that's my comment. But my question is, oh, and one more thing. The vinyl thing. I have never felt so emotional to vinyl like tonight. I'm gonna think about this forever. Thank you so much, Surge. Okay, so my question is, when do you know your work is done? Like, is it ever done, or is it like, oh, today on Tuesday at 3 p.m. it's done? Like, when do you realize that your work has come to it being finished and being able to showcase?
Hey, Miguel. Definitely, thank you so much for answering that. Asking this question. And yeah, it's one of those, when it is a work done, I think I've always, attached that I think Picasso said it, Pablo Picasso, work is never done and a work is never finished. It just stops at an interesting point. And I feel like that's how my work is, where I could easily beat these paintings and create so much to it. And I have in the past, I've always been very chaotic in my work. But also I've learned to, when I'm willing to let go and really let go of ego, let go of self, and also let go of just really letting this piece to kind of breathe, is when I feel like it's done. And I think those factors, ego definitely, or when we think that we're trying to make work, or like we want to make work that people haven't seen, or people to start making these conversations. But in reality, once you examine and you're willing to part ways with it, I think that's a moment when you can release.
Oh, that's a really good question, though, Miguel. What I could say is, like, especially for all the art students out there right now, is that it is definitely a question that a lot of us would be thinking. And for me, what I think is like, the human aspect of like conversations, you know, like when you're having a conversation with somebody and you're so dedicated to the conversation, you're having like these different things and moments that you're exchanging. The artist is exchanging the work, some ideas, the work is giving the artist some ideas, but then there comes a moment where it starts slowing down. That's pretty much where I start going to another piece and I start talking to it in a sense, you know, and just like having these different conversations. And I bring up conversations that I would have with that art piece to another art piece. It's like a whole entire body of conversations that I have with my work just to make it easier for myself when I'm pretty much bringing in the similarities, different aspects of the work so they could communicate with each other, as well as just having this own unique way of just presenting each other. So I think at best case that I could think of in a metaphorical sense would be until the conversation becomes awkward. You know, like when it becomes so awkward when you're feeding that spoon to like somebody, like your words, your ideas, and it gets to the point of just like, what's your favorite food? It's like, you know, it gets to that point. It's like these generic questions that you can't really go deep down in anymore. It comes into these ideas and symbols like you can't really look at, and you're just looking at the piece and it's like, I think we're done talking. And it just goes to that moment that you just go to the next piece and you start talking to it. And maybe like down the line in a month, in a year, in a decade, you could go back to that first piece and be like, hey, I got 2 new conversations for you. Let's talk. So just like Surge said, you know, the conversation, like the work is never finished, but I feel like it's also that it's pretty much so that the conversation doesn't end until the artist ends. That's what I feel.
Jinx, you just like described the relationship. I love it. And also Miguel, I'm a big fan of your masks. I have so many original Miguel Barragan face mask coverings.
Thank you for the shout out. Yes. Thanks.
Welcome.
Wow. Wow, thank you everyone. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Surge. Thank you, Jinx. Thank you everyone who asked questions. That was our last question. I love it. It's like we're so punctual. And I just also wanted to say we are so grateful and appreciative that the 2 of you are speaking, and we're also so grateful and appreciative for everyone in the audience who keeps attending. I see all these familiar names, and for all of you that, you know, spoke up. You'll find in the chat, there's links to our various, you know, medias, our website, our Instagram, etc. And we would love it if you joined us next week. We'll be having our final lecture for the series. Dr. Aaron Day will be talking. He produced this really cool series on Magic Johnson and him coming out, and you know, hey, it's gonna be fun. So that's in the chat as well. We'll also be promoting it on our Instagram. Alex, Nicole, you wanna chime in? Anything you wanna add?
Yeah, I just want to say these were such great questions. That was really amazing. I mean, yeah, just thank you everybody, and thank you Surge and Jinx for the fantastic presentation. Really wonderful, very inspiring.
I just want to add, if you haven't already, go see the work. I mean, this was amazing, but to see the work in person, and they work so well together, it's so exciting for us to have this at our school, in our department, to have, like, I love looking at it every day. So if you have time, please try to make it. It's going to be up for a little while longer. So please try to come on campus and see it, because it's really so great in person.
Definitely. Oh, and then I remembered, we do record our talks. One of the links in there is our YouTube. This one will end up on the YouTube, but you know, we've been doing these talks for years. There's a pretty good YouTube playlist there if you ever want to go check it out. Yeah, thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.